to Policing TV, where I'm delighted to be joined by Trevor Botting. Trevor, thank you so much. We've recorded one segment on your career at Sussex Police. We're now moving on to the second career, I think, that you enjoyed, which was you on your retirement from Sussex, you applied for a post with the British Overseas Territories, and moving from an island, the British Isles, or rather the island of England and Scotland, some 60 million population, you put in for a post with the Saint Helena Police Force, which as the potential commander of that particular force, so chief of police there, a population of some 4,000 people, and one of the most remote locations in the world. What led you to put in that application to be the Commissioner of Police at St Helena?
Thanks, Bernard. Yeah, it was an extraordinary experience, and I'd seen the job advertised, and I am going to talk about my dad just for a second, because dads often are our heroes and our catalysts. And when I considered that job, and you've articulated it very well, it was remote, and it's got an airport now, but when I was there, you had 5.5 days on a ship across the Southern Ocean from Cape Town to get there. And in mulling over whether I could make that transition, my dad, who'd passed by then, but nevertheless always influences still. He was what is known historically as a £10 pom. And for those that don't know, that was in the 60s when there was Australia wanted to encourage migration. They gave you a ticket for £10. And my dad went with £100, 4 suitcases, a wife and 4 children under 6, and went to a country that he didn't really even know where it was. So he was my hero in terms of being a pioneer in his own way. So when I thought about the St Helena, I actually thought, well, why won't I go? If my dad was willing to do that, why wouldn't I go? And that's what I did. So I did take the job. It was with some trepidation. Of course it was. Of course, and the other thing to remember about the job, it had about 5 or 6 hats. Because it's so small, the small territories, very rarely do you have one job. So I was the chief of police, I was the prison governor, chief immigration officer, head of the fire service, head of sea rescue, head of emergency planning. But what kind of got me the job, I think, was they were then just developing an airport, and they wanted someone with airport policing experience. So it was a fascinating job for all of those reasons and those hats I had to wear. So one day you would be policing, and the next day you'll be in the prison dealing with some issues in the prison. And then we had to develop a sea rescue service. So my dad inspired me to make the decision to go, and it's one I absolutely don't regret. But you're right, there was some trepidation in flying into Cape Town, spending 5.5 days on the last remaining Royal Mail ship, crossing the Southern Ocean, and then turning up on this little speck in the South Atlantic to start a job. But every day was a treat and a pleasure, and despite the challenges.
So you won't have been to St Helena before. I'm pretty confident of that before you arrived. What sort of welcome did you get when you did arrive?
I think it's fair to say a really good welcome. It's a British Overseas Territory. There are some tensions between the Overseas Territories and the UK. There's a lot of history that's gone between the territories and the UK, with that word colonialism, which is been from the past, and the British rule. But actually, St Helenians are the most delightful people. I mean, I'm not just saying that, they absolutely are. I've been back 3 or 4 times, even since I've left. So I did get a very warm welcome. They have every right to want a good policing service, and they wanted someone good. So the jury was always out until you'd settled in and got your time. But the initial welcome was very, very warm indeed.
So you had several hats. There is nobody who has experience of deep experience of each and every one of those areas. Policing, fire and rescue, the airports policing side of things, prisons. How did you cope in dealing with the different challenges, some of which you had no experience of whatsoever?
I had a 3 month lead in before I left, and I did call in a few favours from people I'd worked with from other agencies just to start getting a feel. Sorry about that. Just to start getting a feel around the job and how to take it on. So some colleagues from fire and rescue, and of course I had good contacts in the immigration service, having worked at the airport. So I did do my prep before I left, which stood me in good stead. Although obviously, having arrived, then excuse me, I'm just going to kill something. Having just arrived, I made it
Not
my
not
mission
not
to.
anything human, I hope. Just
No,
you're
no, no.
going to deal with.
Of course not. Having arrived, I made it my mission to learn everything I could, and anyone working overseas, I'd encourage this. This first tip is, unless you have to make a decision in the first 3 months, don't, because you'll make a better one some months down the line. And so, of course, some things you had to deal with straight away. That's the nature of the thing. But in terms of coming in and change, because senior police officers are very good at wanting to change things to what they want very quickly. It's not always a good thing. So I think I went there with a really clear mission to listen, and that sounds trite and it sounds like a job interview, but that's the truth of it. And it stood me in good stead. But it was tough at times, and I did use contacts again to call back to the UK and say, look, I'm doing this. What do you think? So again, second tip is never be afraid to ask, because someone's got the answer. It's just finding them.
So the network was important in terms of using your network, your phone book, to phone people who might have previous experience that could supplement the experience that you had. Now, in one particular area, though, you did have deep experience, which was airport policing. And yet, St. Helena didn't have an airport, but was having one built. So, how did that policing experience from Gatwick apply itself in the building of the airport and the preparations for the changes that would take place to St. Helena, the population, um, with the introduction of that airport?
Well, it was an extraordinary experience, because when I arrived, there was just a about 20 white posts hammered into the cliff of where the runway was going to be. So that's the stage I turned up at. So it's unusual in policing. So it was like a national police force of this little island. But I sat in on the planning meetings to help design. When I say I help design the airport, we were consulted around what policing need, what can make the journey for policing, what happens if there's an arrest. But the biggest thing, Bern, I have to say, was around the emergency planning. So aviation's probably the most regulated industry in the world. So whilst this is at the building phase, you have to plan for what the regulation phase will be, because everything's got to work. And a lot of it is process, which means your building's got to be right. People have got to be able to move from A to B, in a certain way. So it was really useful to be involved in that early stage, which I think was by design from the government when they recruited. So it really was making sure that the processes that we were going to end up with at the airport were embedded into the architecture of the airport itself. Where the police office was, did we need cells, all those things. But for the regulations and security part of it, that was absolutely critical. And I'm pleased to say, having used the airport several times, it works. So, but that was the important bit, is looking ahead to the regulation to get a purpose-built airport building, which would work within those regulations.
So clearly, you made a success of your time at St. Helena, because after 4 years, some 4 years there, you were successful in taking on a post as Deputy Commissioner and then Commissioner of the Turks and Caicos Islands. So, uh, had St. Helena whetted your appetite for further such postings, with the Turks and Caicos being not quite as remote, a population about 10 times the size of Saint Helena, so some, I think, 50,000 people. But it's still a relatively small community. You'd enjoyed your time at Saint Helena. You then went and were successful in becoming commissioner at Royal Turks and Caicos. Tell us about that.
Yeah, you're right, Bernard. When I went to St. Helena, it was a 3-year contract. And in my mind, I thought I'd do 3 years and I'd be back in the UK. It was something I wanted to do. But you're absolutely right. I really enjoyed working overseas. It's immensely challenging, but immensely rewarding. You know, you can really influence not just policy change, but operational change. And I wanted to test myself further, really. So when the job on the Turks and Caicos advertised, I applied for that and was good to get it. Was very fortunate and blessed to get that job. So I went there. I spent 2.25 years as the deputy commissioner, and then when the commissioner left at the end of his contract, I applied for the commissioner job, where I spent 4.5 years and finished at the end of November last year. Whilst there is some similarities, they're immensely different territories, and Saint Helena is not quite crimeless. It does have crimes, but it's actually, in terms of community, a very safe community, very safe. And it will have the number of crimes in a year that Turks and Caicos has in a month. So it's very different, and it was a very different role and a very different place to police with different challenges.
So the time that you had at Turks and Caicos, uh, again, you will have experienced some of the challenges of an relatively isolated community through St Helena. I imagine that you were still making good use, though, of your network, and I imagine also that the network that there is of the overseas territories and crown dependencies heads of police that I was fortunate enough to be invited to a meeting of theirs in London not all that long ago, and we met there. That community of those in policing with similar challenges, it's an important one.
Yes, I'd say critical, Bernie. You saw at that meeting, we're quite a tight bunch. We're all diverse as well. Within there, you've got some local people policing their own territories in there as well. But we meet a couple of times a year, and we're on the end of a phone, and we also support each other. So in a way that forces in the UK may use mutual aid between the two, we do where we can. We've all got limited resources. We do where we can support each other. So, for example, one crucial area is when we have an incident, say a police-related shooting, to help the independence of that investigation, we would assist each other by sending investigators to other territories. So there is a level of independence to that inquiry. And there's other discipline matters where we brought people in. So that's a really useful support mechanism between the territories. And it's twofold, really. One, it's still relatively local, it's within the region. But most critically, as opposed to bringing people in from the UK, they've got the local regional context. And that context, operational context, is really, really crucial. I don't know how much you listened to at the meeting, but when we talk about the threat of firearms as one example, it's very different from the UK. So when reviewing a police-related shooting, the local context becomes really critical. So yes, we do support each other. There's some fantastic commissioners working in the Caribbean. And there's some fantastic commissioners who are outside the British Overseas Territories on independent countries who I regard as friends. Now, there's quite a community, because as well as the British Overseas Territories Commissioners Group, there's also an Association of Caribbean Commissioners of Police, which has got 26 members, which I was very proud to say I was the vice president for 18 months of that association. So there's even broader support outside of the overseas territories across all the member states. And I've got support during my time as a commissioner, I brought support in from countries which aren't British overseas territories, Bahamas being one. Trinidad, Jamaica, and Anguilla. So there's people you can bring in from countries which are independent, aren't overseas territories, but that regional policing context becomes really important.
One of the things that's perhaps worth acknowledging is that whilst you are an officer from the UK who's been selected to lead the policing in Saint Helena and subsequently in Turks and Caicos, there are many homegrown, if I can put it that way, senior officers in these Crown dependencies and overseas territories. And indeed, you've mentioned a number of other associated places. Whilst I'm not going to list the full, I don't know, dozen or so Crown dependencies and overseas territories. That clearly, from the meeting that I attended and from your account, a key support group, as indeed the Caribbean heads of police might be. We'll come on in a second to some of the key learning that you've had from that wealth of experience and some reflections on policing as now you sit, I think it's okay to say, back in the UK, and you can reflect on these experiences. But Trevor Botting, for the time being, in this second part of the recording that we're producing, thank you so much for your thoughts on that.